I am Atreyee Majumder. I teach sociology at the National Law School of India, University. With me today is Professor Sushmita Pati. She teaches political science at the National Law School of India, University. We are very happy to celebrate Sushmita's new book. It is her first monograph, am I right? Yeah. The book is called Properties of Rent, Community, Capital and Politics in Globalising Delhi. It is published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, and we're going to get to know a little bit more about the book today. Sushmita, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and we hope that to hear a little bit more about the book through these responses. The book is based on research done in Munirka and Shahpur Jat, urban villages in Delhi. Can you tell us a little bit more about these places and why you chose to work in these places, and a bit more about the book?
So, this work largely began as my PhD thesis. And prior to this, I was more interested in the politics of public history. I was looking at monuments, I was looking at statues. But at the beginning of my PhD, I started gravitating more towards looking at urban forms.
Mm-hmm.
And here, this whole category of urban village seemed very oxymoronic and interesting at the same time. So what are these villages doing in the middle of the city? What has their trajectory been like? And not much had been written about it. So that's the reason I started looking at it with the intention of studying both the spatial and the social transformation of these villages. So what's happening with these villagers who are suddenly finding themselves in the middle of this fast growing city? So as it happens that in terms of when land acquisition happens here, the agricultural land is taken away by the state to create what we understand as south of Delhi today, but their residential villages residential lands are retained. So they're not necessarily displaced. So that's the trajectory I thought I would look at. I started with looking at I just wanted to, in fact, look at just one village. And I started looking at Munirka. But as it happens in political science departments, they don't let you just look at one, right? You have to look at, in fact, my faculty...
Make it a comparison.
Yes, so you have to look at, in fact, I was told that I should look at 6 in order to be able to at least say something comprehensive about these places. And I was like, no, I can't do 6 because I wanted to do like a very telescopic understanding, a much more detailed understanding of one place. In fact, I quite deviously kept it as a study of select villages in South Delhi, because in India you can't, if once you finalize your PhD title, then you can't change it. So I kept the number very vague. But I'm very glad that, in fact, my faculty pushed me to do more than one. Because I started with looking at Munirka, because Munirka is right opposite Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is where I studied. And, as students, you always go in and out of these places. So I thought, finding respondents would be very easy. The second was I was also looking at these urban villages which had given way to creating rental properties. Right, so many of these villages by post 2000s had gone towards making rental housing or rental kind of spaces for earning money. So that was quite central to my work, and that's something I realized. So that's why Munirka became quite an obvious choice, because it's a place for students, it's a place for labor who work in, say, nearby malls. It's a place where UPSC aspirants live. So that's why it became quite an obvious choice. And Shahpur Jat was supposed to be that contrasting village, because Shahpur Jat has given way to government manufacturing more centrally.
Right.
So I wanted to do this to study A, space for migrant labor, and B, space for manufacturing spaces, and sort of get a lens into the new urban political economy of the city. But as I worked on these villages, it became increasingly more clear to me that rent is my is the concept that I have to work with. Rent not in just a colloquial sense that we understand, but in a more in-depth, let's say as a social life of rent, as I'm calling it in the book, as more like an ethos, a way of understanding your relationship with each other within these urban villages. So that's what the work is mostly about.
Right, right. Can you say a little bit about what it was like doing ethnographic research in these two villages?
So first thing was, of course, the familiar bit. Like I said, that I always thought of these spaces as more familiar. But as I started doing field work, I realized how unfamiliar these spaces were, how little I knew about the social worlds of these people and the social history of these places. And as I kept on doing my field work, I also realized that there is a longer historical, territorial story to be told of these villages, which have which have a longer, let's say, existence in this region, right? So there is a historical and social network that these villages are part of. It's mostly through Khap Panchayat that we know of being very infamous in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. Not so much in Delhi. They're far more overtly present. Far more covertly present in that sense. But there is that kind of a social, political, historical affinity that they share as a regional community. So that's something that became very, very clear to me. The other thing was also the story of access, right? So as an very urban, upper class woman, some of these spaces I got very easy access to, which probably women from their own communities don't get access to, right? But there were other spaces, especially the domestic spaces, where I just could never get any access to ever. Right. Because that's where, as in the opposition, which I talk about in the book much more clearly in terms of who's perceived as a threat, who's perceived as an outsider, and who do they want to protect. That became very, very obvious in terms of doing the field work.
Right, right. I understand that you've talked about a little bit in the book about connections with older forms of ownership and property, bhaichara, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about these older forms and the newer forms of rent that you've been talking about?
Right. So, Niladri Bhattacharya's work is quite. It centrally talks about the bhaichara form of land tenure system, which is very, which is in fact very different from, say, the zamindari system that we broadly know of after permanent settlement, and much work has been done on that. In the bhaichara system, what happens is that you don't have a zamindar figure, right? You have it's seen as a collective ownership of some form. Of course, private property exists, and there could be people who have more land and less land. That of course exists, but this sense of collectivity, which is quite strong in this bhaichara form of ownership. So also the collective ownership of Shamlak land, which is the commons, is very, very central to their to this bhaichara form of property, right? And there is another way in which bhaichara is also invoked, which is in Dipankar Gupta's work, who looks at older political forms, agrarian political forms through, say, the study of BKU, which is Bharatiya Kisan Union, and looks at how there is no place for a patronage kind of politics, which you see emerging again in Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Bihar, owing to that zamindari form of land tenure. Here in the northwest part of India, you don't see much of a patronage kind of politics really coming up. So in fact, what Dipankar Gupta would describe this as these form of leaderships as first amongst equals. So there is also that sense of some sort of an equity in these political formations. So I look at their trajectory, both in terms of property and politics. And what I see is that this form of, let's say, collective ownership of land gets translated into cartel forms, right? So when so as landowners and now landlords of these rental units, it's almost a cartel form which the village is now a part of, right? So rents, how rents will go up, how much electricity will be paid, all of these are sort of collectively arrived at, and the panchayat, the village panchayat, becomes the dominant
force,
platform through which sometimes these negotiations are arrived at. I also talk of the kunba. Kunba is mostly a familial unit, right? So I look at how sometimes the kunba behaves like almost a vernacular joint stock company, where where members of the family would invest money in the same property together, so that the rental value of that property sort of goes up. So those kinds of interesting continuities that I see there. But in terms of politics, I see a similar kind of fragmentation, because now with increasing wealth, there is a growing political aspiration where everybody wants to invest in, quote unquote, invest in politics.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's my last chapter, where I look at what is this growing aspiration, growing wealth mean in terms of growing aspiration in politics.
Nice. I understand. My last question to you is: I understand this work is sort of in the ballpark of South Asian scholarship that is often referred to as vernacular capitalism. Would you say so, and if so, why?
So I am using the term vernacular capitalism because this is one form of vernacular capitalism, like I was discussing. But my contention is that, like, much of this literature on vernacular capitalism has sort of looked at, say, for example, the work on Marwari capitalism, or look at, say, Gaunders, or look at, Italian shoe businessmen, or Chinese capitalists. Somehow they've been understood as some variation of form of capital itself. So it's about entrepreneurship, or form of how people become, different kinds of people become capitalists. So Harish Damodaran's book, for example, India's New Capitalists, looks at how people, certain communities, caste groups, invest money in order to become capitalists. What I'm saying is that there is a tension in at least what I am seeing, and this tension is what I'm saying. I'm trying to show it through rent. What I'm saying is that this is not capital. In fact, this is rent. It runs completely counter to the ethos of capital, because capital is about, or at least finance capital is about, quick buying and selling. It's about effacing ownership. Rent, on the other hand, thrives through collective ownership, which has to be very neatly defined, right? So, which is why, in terms of, which is why it is part of capitalism. It is, but there's also a deep tension, and this tension can show in different forms. In some senses, this tension shows in the opposition between the village and the city. Right. So they have this deep-seated anger towards the state. They have a deep-seated anger towards the city. That these are the people who constantly look down upon us and our culture. So when we hear Haryanvi music blaring on top volume, that's actually an assertion of some sort, of that kind of resentment, right? So that's one. But on the other hand, there's also a resentment with capital, right? Where they don't necessarily feel they have benefited. They're, of course, beneficiaries of how land has now become real estate. But on the other hand, there's also this sense of disenchantment, or sort of unhappiness with what capital has done. Because it's also read as a sense of loss. They constantly feel that they have lost to, they've sold out to capital, they've sold out to money, they've sold out to greed. So those kinds of emotions also run pretty strong. So that's also something that I talk about in the book.
Right. Thank you, Sushmita.